Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Ramani Varanasi, and I'm the Managing Director of Arrive Advisors, a Biopharma advisory group I founded, and where I serve as a trusted advisor to executive management, supporting corporate strategy, fundraising, corporate development and operations, in general, company building. I'm also until recently, I also served as the president and CEO, and I am a co-founder of a company called Xbiotics, the company that worked in the antibiotic space targeting superbugs. I really would like to thank the Lioness magazine for hosting this discussion today. And for those who are not aware, Lioness magazine is a premier media outlet for female entrepreneurs, giving women the latest news, tools, and resources to launch and run their startups. And we cover very timely topics on female entrepreneurs and invite them to share their stories about how they've launched and are driving the landscape for prominent startups and organizations that are really poised to be disruptive in the industry. And over the past few months, I've had the pleasure of having conversations with several entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs in particular, who've been very successful in establishing their businesses and growing their businesses and organizations, especially in the life sciences biopharma field and broadly in human health. And today, I'm joined by Dr. Ipshita Mandal-Johnson. Ipshita serves as the founding partner and CEO of the Global Bio Fund, where she's focused on investing in and scaling women-led bioventures addressing human and planetary health. Her focus has been on being inclusive, innovative, and building inclusive, innovative, and sustainable systems that really deliver on sustainable development goals, or SDGs, through venture investment, consulting, research, and as well as advisory roles. She's really a true inspiration. And when we were talking about having her on this session, I was really inspired by her story. And so I invited her to join me today and to share her story with us. And because I really think it'll resonate with a lot of the viewers, readers of the Lioness magazine. So Ipshita, with that long introduction, welcome to the discussion today.
Thanks, Ramani. And it's such a pleasure to have this conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, I really don't want to take the time here to talk. This is really about you, and I'd like to spend some time having you introduce yourself in a little bit more detail than I just did, and talk to us about the Global Bio Fund, what you have established, what you are building, and what the mission of the organization is. So why don't we start with a brief introduction of yourself, and then you can talk to us about your organization.
Absolutely, Ramani. And my story is sort of a humbling one for me often, because I feel a lot of gratitude for the opportunities that have come through in my young and early career story. But I grew up in India, moved countries in Singapore, New Zealand, UK, and US, and have loved especially how we think of technology and the impact it can have in meeting real world challenges. I think that's been one of the overarching sort of purpose or sort of passion of what's kind of steered me in my career journey. I was a researcher, an engineer. I got really excited once during my undergraduate studies, studying the Watson and Crick DNA paper. And at that point made up my mind, sitting in New Zealand, that I was going to travel to the other side of the world and go to the Eagle pub and be doing research discussions at the at an institution like Cambridge. And that took me to Cambridge and working with Professor Nigel Slater, who was the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Enterprise and Technology. We worked on how to have cost-effective biomolecules purification that was sustainable but also cost-efficient for biopharma companies using technologies like microfluidics and fluid mechanics. but also looking at wastewater treatment, which kind of gave me a little bit of this green technologies piece as well about how do we purify wastewater, what sort of molecules and compositions we have. My time at Cambridge also got me to scale some of the work I'd been doing in New Zealand with an organization called Chiasma, which was about building knowledge-based initiatives in a country. So basically, how do we get STEM researchers, young scientists, entrepreneurs to be thinking about innovating and scaling ventures? So in Cambridge, I kicked off an initiative called Biotech Revolution. This was in 2012. And this was kindly advised and mentored by some really dynamic people in the ecosystem. We had Sir Greg Winter, who was one of the initial pioneers of the monoclonal antibody technology from Trinity College, Cambridge. Also, Sir Mene Pangalos from AstraZeneca. He saw the Cambridge ecosystem and spurring innovation and research from that space, a big value to kind of encourage young entrepreneurs, scientists, and professionals. But with Global Biotech Revolution, we built this community of leaders of today and leaders of tomorrow to address challenges in health, in agriculture, in climate change. And it's an initiative that's built up 120 ventures, out of which 18 companies have got funded. I myself then worked in a biotech company in Cambridge called Bactivo Nanotherapeutics, with some lovely co-founders such as David Williams, Giorgio Reggiani, and John Wayne. And it was an amazing experience to work in an early stage platform technology. This was in transposon mutagenesis, transposon genomics, where we were looking at natural products coming from various species of bacteria and even archaea. And we focused on antibiotics initially, found the challenges of the antibiotics reimbursement market, which I'm sure Ramani, you know very well of.
Yes, indeed.
And but steered more towards mitochondrial and neuroscience and rare diseases. And Bactivo got acquired. It was rebranded to Nanotherapeutics, and it got acquired by Stellus last year. And after my time at Nanotherapeutics, I joined McKinsey, working in the pharma and the private equity sector as well. That's a long introduction towards jumping from research, engineering, entrepreneurship, think tanks, biotech, and then consulting as well. But I think this journey for me, Ramani, the most important part of this whole journey is what it's brought towards an understanding of how, as a sector in biotech, having not been a feminist myself over the last 10, 20 years, I would have never picked up my hand and talked about women's rights actively. I have noticed that we have development and systemic barriers towards nurturing women scientists, women entrepreneurs, and women leaders. And some of it is firsthand experience. Some of it is watching other amazing women leaders struggling to really have their full impact. Mm-hmm. And that kind of zeroed me into building the Global Bio Fund. I felt there was a need. I think we needed to focus towards women-led bio ventures. I think I myself feel it was quite hard to focus down just on women. Often we've had that sort of question on why just women, why not other diverse communities? And we felt that any problem that you're trying to solve needs a focus, and you need to think through understanding what exactly are the problems facing women entrepreneurs, but also how do you design solutions and how do you design venture capital to build the best biotech ventures of the future.
So can actually, I mean, there's so much we can dig into here at Ipshita, and we will do that. But one thing, since you touched upon it, let's just go right there. Sort of, let's go to the jugular, as they say. Let's talk about. So you've established the Global Biofund. It's a recent initiative. And you'll talk to us a little bit about what you're specifically doing. But you did bring up a topic, which I think we'll get into, and we'll do it now, and that is the idea or the concept of venture capital, the investment community, perhaps not being where it needs to be in terms of investing in diversity. I was hoping to hold off on this, but this is too important a topic to hold off on. And this is essentially what your Global Biofund is really sort of driving toward in terms of its mission, as I understand it. So tell us a little bit about your research and your perspective on the current VC landscape, investment landscape, and what the gaps are and what you are trying to do with the Global Biofund to fill those gaps, to address those gaps.
I love Ramani. You picked on the elephant in the room, and this is a broader problem. This is not for one fund to solve by itself. The challenge here is the venture capital structure follows similar financial structures and incentive structures like it had from the 1800s when we had the whaling industry. This a beautiful book by Ross Baird of Village Capital that talks about how our systems are quite conservative and haven't evolved from too much in the last 150, 200 years. The specific challenge we have here is one, the people who go into financial sector and venture capital often come from similar backgrounds. So their perception of risk can get quite limited into similar trends that they see. So there's an aspect of who is in venture capital. There's an aspect of how venture capital is structured to really incentivize companies to really flesh and grow, nurture and scale to their full potential. I've worked with a few companies myself that have had venture capital investment, and more interestingly, talked to some of the leading venture capitalists and entrepreneurs about what are the challenges in the field. The limited 7 to 10 year structure that venture capital has, and also the way venture capital manages funds, that there's definitely opportunities for us to improve some of that. But the third point here is with venture capital is the incentives. Of course, it is an asset class that is extremely risky for most private equity portfolio managers, where high risk, high returns. So most venture capitals aim to be delivering a 20% IRR at the end of a fund, which is fair, but we're increasingly moving towards a world where value created is not just financial, but it's also value created to society and value created to the environment. And we don't have financial metrics like an internal rate of return. We should be devising metrics such as an impact rate of return that venture capitalists are responsible on reporting every quarter or every year to their limited partners. So that's some overall sort of opportunities for the venture capital industry. And I put a flag here that I am a first-time investor and grateful for having more experienced venture capitalists in our partnership team. But this is something that's a movement as we're talking of ESG investing and sustainable finance and investing and impact investing. This is a movement that's coming through in the last 10, 20 years, expedited by COVID. And I think there's more for our sector in life sciences and biotech to embed some of these principles as well. And there's a big aspect of inclusion that we can also talk about when it comes to capital.
No, absolutely. So I love the terminology, and maybe, I'm not sure, maybe you probably coined it, this impact rate of return, the IRR, from a very different lens, right? And that is what we need to drive to, and we need that. But I guess the question would be, how challenging is it to get the traditional investor base to think like that? Because traditionally, we live in a capitalistic society, and this is, it's all about kind of the money at the end of the day and the rate of return, and what's the what X are you exiting at, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we get investors who have a traditional way of thinking, and anything that's rooted in tradition is typically very slow to change? How do you get investors who are the big or small players, but how do you get these individuals to think differently? Because fundamentally, there's going to have to be a fundamental mind shift in order to get them over the hump of thinking about an IRR as an internal rate of return to more of an impact rate of return. So it's more from the what do I get versus what can I make sure the community gets. So how are you in your role trying to drive that change? And then the second part of it, let's have you answer that question first. Again, we can go in so many directions, but I'll give you the space to answer that question first.
And I think this is serving our community in some way, Ramani, thinking about some of these innovative financial principles that are coming through. I wouldn't take credit for the impact rate of return. There are researchers from Wharton, Howard Buffett, who's been talking about impact rate of return as a terminology. And also Sir Ronald Cohen has just published a book on impact, and he was one of the pioneers of impact investing out of UK. He had steered Apex Capital and guides the Harvard Business School with George Seraphim on a principle called impact-weighted accounts. But on the note of, I don't think it's a either or part, Ramani. I feel it's both. I think it's thinking of value financially, but also thinking of value social and environmentally. I think there will be a top-down shift. That is the best way. There will be some disruptors and maverick funds like the Global Bio Fund, and there are some very much more established ones from Leapfrog to Root Capital and others who've performed extremely well being impact funds. However, in some way, I think it all comes down to how capital is taxed. And I think there is conversations on at a more global level of how when capital or companies have had a negative impact, either to social communities or to the environment, how you kind of bring this into the financial sheet. You bring this into a taxation part of, you have gained this much capital, you have gained this much value, you have gained this much revenues, but you have also costed the environment and society. And that's a hard one to measure. But there are people in Harvard Business School who've done this with Fortune 100, if not 500 companies. They've created impact-weighted accounts for them. So in some way, I think it will be the pension funds, the sovereign wealth funds, and the private equity funds who are putting capital into the venture capital funds. They will start having regulation towards moving from qualitative stories about, oh, we have an investment in a startup that is led by a BIPOC founder and is having some improvements in health, to quantifying it rather than just qualitative stories to quantifying. And I'll bring this out a little to our fund as well on how we do it. So we have a specific focus on Sdg 5 with gender equality, and that is our route towards broader impact on the other SDGs. The way we've kind of quantified is through working on established gender lens metrics that have been set up by the Gender Smart Initiative and the 2X Collaborative on measuring gender diversity at board level, at advisory board level, at executive, at employee, and also products and services and markets. And there's a beautiful framework that's been set up on this. And we look at this, Ramani, not just through the initial due diligence of companies. So even the companies that we are starting to have investment conversations with, we will be putting this metrics on diversity. And of course, there's some compromises we make because there are very few really diverse companies out there. But also in terms of the management of the company over the coming decade, where you look at similar syndicate investors, and also as we do measurement of success for this company and we're looking at their market traction and the development of their technology, we are looking at measuring these gender principles at a quarterly level with them as well, kind of being cognizant of this in the operation of the business.
So you're coming at this, there's an impact perspective, impact investing perspective, but there's also a diversity perspective, right? And you're sort of combining those. There are groups that do impact investing, but that are not necessarily solely focused on diverse founders and BIPOC and, the marginalized communities, that the entrepreneurs within marginalized communities, but rather it sounds like with your approach is very much focused on the impact investing and the SDG driven effort combined with the diversity driven effort. Now, I'm curious to know, you've got your own story that you started to share with us. So maybe we can have a little bit of an open dialogue about the diversity component, because, a lot of, what we find that data indicates that women founders, it's difficult for women to raise money without going into all the statistics behind that. But the data suggests that women have a tougher time raising money, and there are a variety of reasons as to why. And diverse women of that are of color, so to speak, also have very even more difficulty. You are a woman of color. Are you willing and able to speak about any biases you faced in your career as you've gotten to where you've gotten to? Number one, how did you overcome those? Number two, and then number three, how did that impact your ability? Clearly it hasn't, but I'm curious to know your journey about building the Global Biofund, because you've sort of, this is a big effort you're trying to do. This is a big mission you're trying to tackle, and I applaud you for that. And I wish you all the success with it. But as a woman of color, how have you managed to navigate your journey to getting here?
I think the big part, and I'll maybe touch the part of impact and gender lens investing quickly now. Impact investing across any SDG, all the 17 SDGs, you could be focusing on a few of them. And gender lens investing gender lens impact investing, because gender lens can be on any sort of financial vehicle, impact or not. We've focused on the impacts, the gender lens side of impact investing, which is definitely making things more and more challenging in some way. But for us, and I'll move to my personal story in a second, Ramani, I think it's all about the business case, actually, because we did a lot of research. So 2 years back, when we started thinking about this, even before COVID, we were starting to piece together, why don't we have more gender smart businesses in this sector, in the bio life sciences sector, and how successful are they? Coming back to is it even worth it? Are we trying to be all good? Does it make business sense? And we just saw that time and again, without just quoting the odd Forbes or Fortune report or whatever it is, boards that had gender diversity, teams that had founders that were gender smart. So it's not about just women or just men, it's just having good diversity in a team. They were performing better. And then you looked at it in terms of their revenues long term. You looked in terms of the employee satisfaction. You looked in terms of the durability of the business. They were just performing better. And it made sense, because when we have people from different experiences and skill sets and genders and sexualities and ethnicities working together, we argue because we think of risks differently. And the ultimate decisions that are made are much stronger for a business. So that for us was the sort of, it makes sense to have these diverse teams. Coming back to Ramani, the question on myself, I have to say I was just unconscious of biases. If it's due to race or ethnicity, or if it is due to gender, I don't think I think there's something about growing up with immigrant Asian parents where you kind of feel like a bulldozer going through your career, where you do not look for excuses ever. You're just bombing through walls, you've got a mission in mind, and you decide, I want to go start a company, I want to go and do this research, I want to go and work with this brand company, and you just go and make it happen, and you don't look for excuses. So I think for most part of my life, I was blind to the biases, but for sure, I mean, working in a biotech company, coming to US for conferences, huge conferences, going into fundraising meetings, and I'm sure, Ramani, I'm not sure if you've had similar incidents, but I've heard many women leaders across different companies and regions have this part of often being the only woman in the room, discussing about the technology in the company, often also not being taken seriously to be the leader of a company, because people would almost second question if you are the CEO and someone else in your team actually is running the show. But I think moving away from the biotech sector and fundraising, this is even more essential, goes back deeper into our education systems as well. I come from one of the more patriarchal cultures in India, where even when I was, I guess, 10 or 12 years old and acing my class, having some driven parents, making sure I was working off my time to get all the best marks. School teachers saying that you're a girl and your priorities should be different. When you're older, you'll be focusing more on relationships and fashion rather than your career. And this was to a 10 or 12-year-old. So I feel these sort of biases, conscious or unconscious, I think we face all the way from education, university, entrepreneurship, startups, I would say corporate, some of the bigger brands I've worked with as well. I've seen similar incidents, which becomes even harder to talk about because you are in a bigger system and how you relay feedback is so driven towards your promotion cycles. So it's just there in different places.
You know, I just add something there, you know, something that you said earlier, Ipshita, if I can just add the, you know, when women coming back, bringing it back to the investment side of things for a moment, when I think there's data that shows that when men pitch to a set of investors, the questions that they are asked by the investors are typically focused on what are the strategies you would think of to grow the company, to build revenue, to extend product life, et cetera. You know, how do you sort of look forward? With women, the questions they're asked are quite risk oriented. You know, how do you mitigate risk? If this problem arises, how do you navigate around that problem? So already the investors are questioning these individuals gender specifically, right? So with men, it's about growth. With women, it's about how do you mitigate risk? And so to your point, I think we all have unconscious biases. There's no finger pointing at all. I think we all walk into a room not being aware of ourselves sometimes and of the situation around us. And I think all we can do is, you know, navigate around it and become more aware and educate ourselves, which I know you've certainly done with your experiences. I do want to also just come back a little bit to the investment side of things and just bring it back to the Global Bio Fund. You've been talking to LPs and raising a fund. You are also thinking of investments as you talk to women and entrepreneurs in general, founders. What are the kinds of investments that get your attention, and how do you, as an investor, evaluate pitches? And even entrepreneurs, how do you pick someone to invest in?
And that flows very well with the due diligence part of the investment piece. And with how we look at companies, I think for us, the first part is we are genderless. So between our team, spread between US and UK and Australasia, since the beginning of this year, we've kind of said we're open to looking at investments and putting early and growth stage capital. So that's between seed, Series A, B capital into companies. And we've received a lot of entrepreneurs reaching out to us. And I think the first filter for us is to see, is there a CEO, CTO, COO, that there's a woman there? And it doesn't have to be often just a woman-led company or all women at all. In fact, we get nervous if we see only women in an executive team, but it's seeing that balance and a strong position for a woman entrepreneur. And it's funny sometimes, Ramani, we've seen that's been an initial filter. We have the same quality metrics to any venture capital. So you'd see there's Harvard Business Review evaluates that VC funds probably look at 100 pitches and only invest in 1 to 3 companies. And it's all looking at the intellectual property, the technology, and the market. Those three, of course, and there's a big people element to it, but we still have those same quality metrics of a good company, plus added the challenge of gender lens. And we've found, to your point on the due diligence questions, one, we find the male entrepreneurs are much more confident than the female entrepreneurs. And I'd like to qualify the meaning of confidence. And I think that's where venture capitalists need to be more smarter of how we look at these companies, because it's the same thing as women putting themselves out for jobs. Women often will be looking at 100% of them meeting a metric and then applying. It's a similar in a VC fund where we find women, when they're pitching, are much better at being risk conscious and saying, we haven't done this, but this is our plan to do this. And so that's one part of it, that there's just a different way women entrepreneurs pitch than male entrepreneurs. And I've seen a lot of workshops and inspirational talks and VCs asking women entrepreneurs to step up and become like confident male entrepreneurs. And I don't think that's the solve. I think there's definitely dealing with confidence issues or your value and dealing with imposter syndrome. Those are definitely things one can work on for women entrepreneurs. But I think there's a beauty towards being more factual and being more cognizant of where your business is, and I think there's a huge value on having that credibility that often more honest conversations led by a diverse team can have. I think 2 or 3 things, Ramani, that whilst having looked at hundreds of pitches this year, I've kind of come down to where first time or women entrepreneurs can do a better job of when they're pitching. I find firstly is not feeling, when venture capitalists are asking you tough questions, stick to your gun. You don't have to be defensive and you don't have to feel overwhelmed. I think it's almost like for the entrepreneurs to see this is an opportunity to kind of talk about the gaps and weaknesses of the technology and use the investor to address those gaps. Mm-hmm. So when you're getting tough questions, firstly, just embrace it and accept it. It's not a personal attack or anything. It's more, how do we build a business? The second part I find is pushing back on the investors itself. I find the best entrepreneurs will be ask us, so what networks do you have? How much sector experience, or what sort of relationships do you have in the clinical side, or with pharmaceutical relationships, or with payers, or even with tech companies? Where are your relationships? How can you help me? Do you have the growth capital to help my business in my next fundraising round? So don't be afraid to push back on the investor is another part I find important. And thirdly, I think sticking to your values. I think often there is the Silicon Valley principle of fake it till you make it.
Yes, we've all heard that.
And I don't think, I personally disagree with that. I feel a better way to do it is mistake it till you make it is another good one I've seen. I think the fake it till you make it principle has unfortunately been something that some women entrepreneurs, especially younger ones, have felt they need to imbibe a certain persona and need to talk about their company in a certain way to make it sound bigger and bolder. And frankly, it's not the women entrepreneurs' fault, because a lot of male entrepreneurs do this all the time. But when we have big failures and faults, like the Theranos example, then everyone kind of singles out into a women entrepreneur like Elizabeth Holmes, saying, you are trying to be another Holmes. And it is sad that our system singles out on just the women entrepreneurs to do that, because both sets of entrepreneurs do it. I think if we are more comfortable in who we are as founders and leaders, and are accepting to grow ourselves and build ourselves, and not having to paint a pretty perfect picture, but be confident of our deficiencies and add team members and investors and advisors who complement our weaknesses. I think that helps. So yeah, I think that's a few learnings that I've kind of had watching quite a few pitches this year.
That's really good sage advice, and I think the viewers, the listeners of this clip on Lioness magazine will really appreciate it, because it is women entrepreneurs, women-driven businesses, and I think guidance like this is always helpful for them to embrace and to have at hand. I guess another thing let's kind of come to is as the CEO of this initiative, you are having to do it all, right? You are building a fund, which I can't imagine is, it's not an easy path. You're learning a little bit along the way, although you're bringing a lot of learned experience as well. What keeps you up at night as you continue to think about building this endeavor? You're talking to LPs, you're thinking about investments, you're networking with possible founders and CEOs, CTOs, et cetera. You're doing a lot. So what keeps you up at night? And then the other component of this is, how do you measure success for the fund?
It's entrepreneurs. I think it's the founders that keep you up at night. I think that they're the ones who make you passionate about the work, because I think as an investment vehicle, the fund and all the partners have built companies themselves. We are all founders ourselves, and we don't see ourselves at we look at the companies that we're doing due diligence and looking at investing, and they feel like they are our companies. And what keeps us up is thinking through just how do we bring enough of networks and capital and relationships so to this particular opportunity that can be a huge thing. So one of the companies I've been very excited about is a medical device company that helps mothers produce more breast milk through a technology that they've developed and clinical validation that they've done that improves the experience of breast milk production, but also makes it much more tunable for mothers to be doing it wirelessly. So it's sort of like a more comfortable device to a breast pump device. And I think it's the entrepreneurs are two BIPOC founders, really driven. And I worry that, how will this technology scale to its full potential? How will this market? So that's sort of, and there's 2 or 3 or 5 of these companies that we have that keep me up at night thinking, how are we going to build this out? For our fund success, Ramani, very tangibly, one simple success metrics is having a handful of successful billionaire women-led companies. And they've scaled up amazing ventures, and not only are they addressing Sdg 5 of gender equality, but improving access to health with Sdg 3. They're just the businesses of the future. And in years' time, being able to kind of showcase that these are the entrepreneurs we were behind is what success for the fund is. But that's at a fund level. I think success is also broader for us as a community, and moving those numbers of 1 to 2 to 3% of venture capital gone to women-led ventures. I think even in the life sciences sector, us syndicating and working with other like-minded investors, even if they have an impact lens or not, even if they have a gender lens or not, some part of their portfolio and their fund, they are able to allocate to women-led ventures. I think building this broader ecosystem and community that we collaborate with, and in 10 years' time, again, seeing that billions of dollars of capital through all the funds we work with have gone to women-led bioventures is a broader success point. So one is for us to stay honest on our companies, but second is the systemic success as well.
And again, it goes without saying, but just to reconfirm, the LPs that you have been having these dialogues with are fully supportive of the sort of the tenet on which you've built this organization, right? So the notion of women-led companies need to be funded, and there is a strength in the thesis of funding diversity. I'm assuming that this resonates with them 110%.
I'll give you the honest answer, but also the opportunity answer. I think there are a lot of traditional limited partners coming from pure financial backgrounds. They get scared when you mention terms like impact and value capital, because to them that sounds too philanthropic, and they get, and for good reason. I think we have empathy towards they have a fiduciary duty to provide good returns to people who have invested with them. However, I think what we've seen with the LPs we've talked with, if that's institutional investors or family offices, we find there is just that appetite of, this is not quick capital, this is not a quick success. They love, actually, I would say, I think they just love our investment thesis, and they just want to invest, and they're looking at it at a medium to long-term journey. So it's not something that is a 5-year relationship. They're thinking, we are in this journey with this organization and these group of people for 10, 15, 20, 25 years, 30 years time, fund to fund. So I think we're finding the people who both want a solid financial return, but have strong values towards diversity and impact are the ones who are our champions. And we're finding them in all the regions. I think in US, in UK, in Australasia, we're finding I wouldn't say that there's one region that has a dominance of these people. So I think it's a journey for us. We've been very cautious, Ramani. There's such a biotech bubble right now in the sector that everyone wants to invest in this industry. We've had to be careful not talking to LPs who just have a financial lens. So in some way, we've been almost trying to scare our LPs off in that we want to measure success with both internal rate of return and impact rate of return. Do you want to do this with us? And that does scare away 8 out of 10 LPs. So.
Yep. Well, at the end of the day, you will end up finding the LPs that are meant to be working with you, and vice versa. So it's sort of, it's sort of electrons that'll, you'll kind of bump into each other, or atoms at the right time, and then, do great things there with them. I think, this has been a great conversation, Ipshita, and we can continue certainly on this topic, but I do want to kind of start to wrap us up. And one question I'd like you to speak to, although I think, there's so many answers, I think, to this question I can certainly provide. But what is your superpower? You've built this organization, you continue to build it. What's your superpower? How do you make it all happen?
It's a little pumping up yourself, but I'll mention it.
I asked you the question, so you're go ahead. You're free to provide me a detailed answer.
It's a humble disruptor is the way I think of myself. I think there is a, how do we improve systems? How do we do things? How do we evolve systems? But with coming into it with humility and with an openness to learn from people who have been successful, and not criticizing. I think it's often disruptors can put down, if that's other LPs, other investors, other entrepreneurs, you can say that their model is wrong and our model is right. I think it is what's worked for me time and again is finding allies and kind of bringing people into the journey with us. I think it's not being you are wrong and we are right. So that humble disruptor is probably my key part. And I think relationships. I think technology, entrepreneurship, investments, the one thing I've learned on is it's about relationships. So as you're being a humble disruptor, how do you build deep trust-based relationships with people? That's been I've given you 2 now, Ramani.
This is brilliant. It's brilliant, actually. And I'll just sort of add something here. It's very rare that you find people who sort of know what they're good at and then know what to do with it. And I was listening to a podcast this morning, and someone on the podcast basically put a quote out there, and apparently it's a Picasso quote, and I'll just quote it for you because as you're talking, I'm reminded of it. And that is, the meaning of life is to find your gift. The purpose of life is to give it away. And I think you're kind of at that purpose stage. You sort of know what you're good at, what you want to do, and where you can truly add value. So this has been a really great conversation, Ipshita. Thank you again so much. And one final comment that I'd like from you is, where can people find you? At LinkedIn, where else are you active?
I think the best part is LinkedIn, and I'm also on Twitter, and feel free to just reach out. I think always open to either have a conversation or, again, coming back to relationships, connecting folks to someone who is able to support you in your growth journey. So those channels work.
Yep. No, absolutely. And I think, the Lioness magazine viewers, listeners, audience will be very, very appreciative of what you just said there. So don't be surprised if you get a bunch of, outreaches from them. So finally, I'd just like to wrap up here, and I want to thank everyone for tuning in again today. My name is Ramani Varanasi, and I hope you'll continue to join us as I engage in future conversations with women entrepreneurs who are really trying to make a difference here, pushing to make a difference and driving change really broadly in the human health and well-being sectors. And so thanks again, Ipshita, for joining me. And do you have any other final comments you'd like to make before we wrap up?
Just that, such a big fan of the Lioness magazine and the work that Ramani, you and Bobby Carlton are leading. So can't wait to meet other women entrepreneurs and leaders that you interview. Thank you for having me.
It was my pleasure, and thanks again for joining, and we'll see you all soon.